The application hit Dr. Morrison's desk with a dull thud. 62 years old, retired paramedic, 28 years in the field. He didn't even finish reading before sliding it toward the reject pile. The ER needed young blood, fresh energy, people who could handle 12-hour shifts without their knees giving out. But HR had mandated the interview, so here she sat. Margaret Chen, gray hair pulled back tight, hands that trembled slightly when she reached for the water glass. The nursing supervisor actually laughed when Margaret left the room, not quietly either. A full, dismissive laugh that carried down the hallway. They gave her the position anyway. Liability insurance required a certain number of hires over 50. She'd work registration, answer phones, stay out of the way. Nobody expected what those hands could do. Nobody knew what that mind remembered. And when the ambulance doors burst open 3 weeks later, when the screaming started in a language that made every translator app fail, when the blood hit the floor and the monitors started their terrible singing, every single person who had dismissed her would learn exactly what 28 years of hell had actually taught her. Margaret's first day started at 6 a.m. with a training video from 1998. The VHS tape stuck twice. She watched it alone in a closet they called the orientation room, learning how to log patients into a computer system that had been outdated when she was still running calls in South Boston. The other registration clerks were polite, distant. They spoke around her rather than to her, discussing their weekend plans and dating app disasters as if she were a piece of furniture that happened to occupy a chair at the desk. She didn't mind. She'd spent 3 decades being invisible until the moment someone needed her. This was just a different kind of waiting. The ER hummed with its usual chaos, chest pain in Bay 3, possible stroke and imaging, a kid who'd stuck a Lego up his nose so far that his mother had driven 40 minutes from the suburbs in a panic. Margaret logged them all in, her fingers slower on the keyboard than the 20-somethings beside her, but accurate. Always accurate. Dr. Morrison passed her desk 6 times that first week without making eye contact. By week 2, the other clerks had stopped trying to include her in conversations entirely. She became the one who took the overnight shifts nobody wanted, who covered holidays, who stayed late when someone called in sick. Her apartment was empty anyway, had been since Robert died. The quietness of her life had a shape now, a routine. Coffee at 5 a.m., work by 6, home by 7 p.m., frozen dinners, British baking shows, sleep. It was enough. It had to be enough. Week 3 started like all the others, Monday morning. Coffee, bitter and strong. The drive through darkness to the hospital where fluorescent lights bleached everything the same shade of exhausted. She logged into her computer, checked the overnight admissions, prepared for the usual parade of humanity in crisis. The ambulance call came in at 7:43 a.m. Margaret heard it over the radio system that fed into registration. Mass casualty incident, construction site collapse, multiple trauma, ETA, 6 minutes. The ER exploded into controlled chaos, nurses running, doctors shouting orders, equipment carts rolling. The attending physician, a man named Carson, who'd been in emergency medicine for 15 years, started calling out bay assignments. His voice carried that particular tone of command that came from managing disasters. Margaret stayed at her desk. This wasn't her world anymore. She logged, she typed, she answered phones, she stayed out of the way. The first ambulance arrived at 7:49 a.m., 2 patients. Construction workers, one with a crushed leg, the other with a tension pneumothorax. The ER team swarmed them, efficient, practiced. They knew their roles. Second ambulance third. The bays filled. The noise rose. Somewhere a monitor started alarming. Someone shouted for O-negative blood. Margaret's hands didn't shake anymore. Funny how that worked. They'd trembled when she held a coffee cup, but now, with the familiar sound of emergency medicine filling her ears, they went steady, still, ready. The fourth ambulance came in different. She heard it before she saw it. The sirens had a quality of desperation. The EMTs were shouting before the doors opened, and then the screaming started. Not pain screaming. Margaret knew pain screaming. Every octave, every variation, every language pain spoke. This was different. This was terror. This was words in a language that hit her ears like a fist to the chest. Vietnamese, rapid, panicked, the accent from the north, Hanoi maybe, or one of the provinces near the Chinese border. The patient was a man, mid-40s, covered in concrete dust and blood. impaled through the abdomen by a piece of rebar that the EMTs had cut down to 2 feet but couldn't remove. He was screaming at them, at everyone, grabbing at hands, fighting. His eyes were white with terror. The EMT's report came in fragments. Vietnamese immigrant, no English, no family on site, conscious and combative, blood pressure dropping, pulse 130. They'd started 2 large-bore IVs in the ambulance, but he'd torn one out. The rebar had gone through his lower right quadrant. Possible liver laceration, possible bowel perforation. He needed surgery, immediately. But he was fighting everyone who touched him. Dr. Carson tried first. Calm voice, slow words. The patient screamed louder, grabbed the doctor's stethoscope hard enough to leave marks on his neck. A nurse tried, then another. They needed to assess him, needed to get him stabilized, needed to stop the bleeding that was soaking through the sheets. But every time someone approached, he fought. His hands were strong. His terror was stronger. Someone called for restraints. Someone else ran for the translation phone service. The patient's screaming had words in it. Margaret could hear them from her desk 20 feet away. He was begging, pleading. The words tumbled over themselves. Jung gia toi ko gia jin, kon toi, vo toi, shin jung. Don't kill me. I have family, my children, my wife. Please don't. Margaret stood up. She didn't remember deciding to stand, didn't remember walking, but her feet carried her across the ER floor, past the nurse's station, past Dr. Morrison, who was shouting into a phone about surgical consult, past the crowd of people trying to figure out how to help a man who couldn't understand they were trying to save him. She reached the bay. The patient saw her. Another face, another person coming to hurt him. He screamed louder, tried to curl away from her even though the movement made blood pulse around the rebar. Margaret spoke. Her voice was quiet, steady, words she hadn't used in 40 years but that came back like muscle memory. Bin tin, toyo jai je gyup unton. Calm down. I'm here to help you. You're safe. The patient stopped screaming. His eyes locked onto hers, confused, desperate. He spoke again, faster now, words pouring out. Ho se giet toi, nhu ho jan lam voi an toi, ben vien nai, ho kong kun goin hu chung toi. They're going to kill me, like they did my brother. This hospital, they don't save people like us. The ER had gone quiet. Everyone was staring, at Margaret, at the patient who had stopped fighting, at the impossible thing happening in Bay 4. Margaret moved closer. Her hands came up slowly, non-threatening. She kept talking, kept her voice level, explained what she was doing before she did it, told him about the rebar, about the surgery, about how everyone here, every single person in this room, was trying to save his life. He listened, his breathing slowed. Not much, but enough. She asked his name, Nguyen Thanh, asked about his family, wife and 3 children, asked what he remembered, the collapse, the darkness, the metal punching through him, the fear that he was dying, that he'd die like his brother had died 5 years ago in a different hospital where nobody spoke his language and he'd coded alone, terrified, without anyone to tell him it would be okay. Margaret understood. God help her, she understood. She kept talking, explaining, translating. The doctors needed to examine him, needed to see how bad the injury was. She would stay. She would tell him everything they were doing. He wasn't alone. Toi seo jai, toi hua. I'll be here, I promise. Nguyen Thanh nodded. His hand reached out, found hers, held on. Dr. Carson approached slowly. Margaret translated his words, explained the examination. Nguyen flinched, but didn't fight. Let them check his abdomen. Let them assess the bleeding. Let them start new IV lines because the ones he'd torn out needed replacing. The assessment took 4 minutes. 4 minutes during which Margaret stood at Nguyen's head, holding his hand, translating every word, every procedure, every touch before it happened. The rebar had penetrated his liver. He was bleeding internally. He needed emergency surgery, immediately. But he was stable enough now to move. Stable enough to get to the OR because he wasn't fighting, because someone had finally made him understand he was safe. They prepped him for transport. Margaret kept translating, kept promising she would be there when he woke up. She would tell his family. She would make sure someone who spoke his language was with him. But the OR team came down. They wheeled him out. His hand slipped from hers. His eyes held hers until the doors closed. Margaret turned around. Every person in the ER was staring at her. The nurses, the doctors, the other registration clerks who'd barely spoken to her in 3 weeks. Dr. Morrison stood near the nurses' station, his phone still in his hand, his expression unreadable. The nursing supervisor, the one who'd laughed, spoke first. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "You speak Vietnamese," Margaret nodded. "Where did you learn?" This was the question, wasn't it? The one she'd spent 40 years not answering. The one that came with stories she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself they weren't real. Almost. "I was a combat medic, Vietnam, 1972 to 73, Army Nurse Corps." The silence got heavier. Someone's pager went off. Nobody moved to check it. "Doctor," Morrison stepped forward. "You were in Vietnam." "Yes." "As a medic?" "Nurse. Then paramedic when I came home. 28 years with Boston EMS." Carson, the attending who'd been trying to manage the crisis, spoke next. "The language, you learned it there." "I learned it because I needed to. Because men were dying and screaming in words nobody understood, and someone had to be able to tell them they weren't alone. Someone had to be able to ask where it hurt. Someone had to explain that we were trying to help, not hurt." She could see it in her head. The field hospital, the heat, the mud, the endless parade of bodies too young, too broken, too far from home. Vietnamese civilians caught in crossfire, RVN soldiers, NVA prisoners, Viet Cong fighters, all of them bleeding the same, all of them scared the same. She'd learned the language in 3 months, immersion by necessity, learned it well enough to take medical histories, well enough to comfort, well enough to translate for surgeons who needed to know exactly where the shrapnel was, exactly what the patient was feeling, exactly how long ago the injury happened. She'd been 21 years old, fresh out of nursing school, stupid enough to volunteer, young enough to think she could save everyone. The war had taught her different. Dr. Morrison's voice cut through her memories. "Your application said paramedic, retired." "That's what I wrote. You didn't mention combat medicine, didn't mention Vietnam. You didn't ask, and most people don't want to hear about it anyway." The nursing supervisor made a sound, not quite a laugh this time. Something else, something that might have been shame. "We put you in registration." "Yes." "You've been answering phones for 3 weeks." "Yes." "You could have said something, could have told us." Margaret met her eyes, held them. "Would you have believed me? 62-year-old woman with shaky hands? Or would you have thought I was exaggerating, living in the past, making myself sound more important than I was?" Nobody answered. The answer was obvious. Dr. Carson cleared his throat. "The patient, Nguyen. He's going to need someone when he wakes up, someone who can explain what happened, someone he trusts. I'll be there. And his family, they'll need translation, updates, someone who can help them understand." "I'll do it." Morrison stepped closer. His expression had changed. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by something that looked like assessment, like calculation. "How much trauma have you seen? Real numbers." Margaret thought about it. About the field hospital, about the Boston streets, about the gang violence and the car wrecks and the domestic disputes gone deadly, about the children who'd drowned and the elderly who'd fallen and the addicts who'd overdosed, about every bad day across 3 decades. More than I can count, more than I want to remember. Gunshot wounds, hundreds. Stabbings, same. Multi-system trauma? That was most of Vietnam, that was half of Boston. Carson and Morrison looked at each other. Some kind of silent communication. Carson nodded. Morrison turned back to Margaret. "We need trauma nurses, experienced ones, people who can handle mass casualties, people who don't freeze when things go bad." He paused. "People who can communicate with patients nobody else can reach." Margaret understood what he was offering, what he was asking. A return to the work she'd thought she'd left behind. A return to the blood and the screaming and the impossible choices. A return to the part of herself she'd tried to bury under registration desks and frozen dinners and British baking shows. "I'm 62 years old. My hands shake. I can't run like I used to. You ran to that patient just fine." "That's different. That was..." She stopped, couldn't finish. Carson finished for her. "That was what you were made to do." Was it? She didn't know anymore. She'd spent so long being invisible, so long being quiet, so long pretending that part of her life had ended cleanly, completely, without residue. But Nguyen's hand in hers had felt right. The Vietnamese words in her mouth had felt right. The crisis and the blood and the desperate need to make someone understand they weren't going to die alone. That had felt right in a way nothing had felt right since Robert's funeral. I'd need training on your systems, your protocols. I've been out of clinical work for 8 years. We can do that. I'd need time. I'm not as fast as I was. You were fast enough today. She looked around the ER, at the bays still full of patients from the construction collapse, at the nurses moving efficiently between them, at the monitors and the equipment and the controlled chaos of emergency medicine. This place, this work, this terrible, beautiful, impossible work of catching people at their worst moment and pulling them back from the edge. I'll need to be with Nguyen when he wakes up, when his family comes. I made him a promise. Morrison nodded. Of course. And I want it on record, in my file, all of it. Vietnam, Boston, every bit of experience, no more hiding, no more being dismissed because of my age or my resume or because someone thinks they know what I can handle. Done. She took a breath. Let it out slowly. Felt something shift in her chest, something that had been locked tight for a very long time. Okay, I'll do it. The nursing supervisor stepped forward, extended her hand. I owe you an apology, a real one. I judged you. I laughed. I was wrong. Margaret took her hand, shook it. Yes, you were. I'd like to be wrong again, if you'll let me. I'd like to work with you, learn from you. We'll see. The rest of the shift blurred. Margaret stayed in the ER, not at the registration desk, in the bays, helping. Her hands remembered, her body remembered, the controlled urgency. The priority assessment, the way to move in a crisis without wasting motion. She was slower than the young nurses, yes, but she was steady, certain. She knew what mattered and what could wait. At 2 p.m., Nguyen came out of surgery. Successful repair. Liver laceration closed, no bowel perforation, stable. He'd live. Margaret was there when he woke up in recovery, disoriented, scared. She spoke to him in Vietnamese, explained the surgery, told him about his family waiting upstairs, promised him again that he was safe, that everyone here was working to help him heal. He cried, held her hand, called her Chi, the Vietnamese term for older sister, thanked her for saving his life. She wanted to tell him she hadn't saved it. The surgeons had, the nurses had, the whole team had. She'd just translated, just held his hand, just made him feel less alone. But maybe that was saving someone too. Maybe that counted. His family arrived at 3. Wife, 3 children, teenagers. They spoke better English than their father, but they were terrified. Margaret sat with them, translated the medical updates, explained what recovery would look like, answered their questions. The wife hugged her, wouldn't let go for a long moment, whispered, "Thank you," in Vietnamese over and over. Margaret left the hospital at 8 p.m., 14 hours. Her feet hurt, her back ached, her hands were steady. She stopped at the store on the way home, bought real food, not frozen dinners, ingredients. She hadn't cooked in months, years maybe. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt like a beginning. The next morning she came in at 6 a.m., not to registration, to the ER doctor. Morrison met her with a training schedule, 3 weeks of protocol review, equipment certification, computer system training. Then she'd start official shifts as a trauma nurse. They were putting her on the overnight rotation initially. Fewer patients, more time to get her bearings. She could move to days once she was comfortable. She looked at the schedule, looked at Morrison. I'll take days. Overnight is for people who need to ease into things. I don't need that. He smiled, actually smiled. Days it is. The other nurses welcomed her differently now, not as the old woman at the registration desk, as a colleague, as someone who'd proven herself. They asked questions about Vietnam, about Boston, about the calls she'd run and the things she'd seen. She answered some, kept others to herself. Some stories were hers alone. Nguyen stayed in the hospital for 6 days. Margaret visited him every shift, brought his family updates, helped coordinate with the surgical team, watched him heal. On the day he was discharged, he gave her a gift, A small jade pendant. Protection, he said, for the person who had protected him. She wore it on every shift. 3 months in, the ER got another mass casualty. Car accident, minivan versus semi-truck, multiple pediatric trauma. It was bad, the kind of bad that made even experienced nurses go pale. Margaret worked triage, moved between the children, kept her voice calm, her hands steady. She'd seen worse. She'd survived worse. These kids would too. Most of them. One didn't, 8 years old. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop. She held his hand while he died, spoke to him softly, made sure he wasn't alone. Afterward, she sat in the break room and cried. Just for a minute, just enough to let the grief out before it calcified into something harder. Dr. Carson found her there, sat down beside her, didn't say anything, just sat. After a while, he spoke. This job, it breaks everyone eventually, different ways, different times, but it breaks everyone. I know. You keep coming back anyway. Yes. Why? She thought about it, about the field hospital, about Boston, about Nguyen's hand in hers and the children today and all the people in between, about the terrible privilege of being there at the worst moment of someone's life and making it just a little bit less terrible. Because someone has to. Because I can. Because when I don't, I feel more broken than when I do. He nodded. Yeah, that's it exactly. 6 months in, they offered her a permanent position. Full-time trauma nurse, benefits, retirement contribution, more money than she'd made in registration, more responsibility too. She accepted. A year in, they asked her to help develop a language access program for the ER, training for staff on working with interpreters, cultural competency. She said yes, started teaching, started sharing the things she'd learned about communication across language barriers, about how fear and pain and hope sounded the same in any language if you knew how to listen. The registration clerks who'd ignored her now smiled when she passed. The nursing supervisor who'd laughed became a friend. They had coffee sometimes, talked about the job, about life, about second chances. Dr. Morrison, who'd almost thrown her application away, nominated her for the hospital's Excellence Award. She didn't win, didn't care. The nomination itself was enough, recognition that she wasn't invisible anymore, that her experience mattered, that age and shaky hands didn't define competence. Margaret still worked days, still took the hard cases, still showed up when things went bad and people needed someone who'd seen worse and survived it. She wasn't the fastest nurse, wasn't the strongest, but she was steady, reliable, unshakable in crisis. And when patients came in scared, speaking languages nobody else understood, they called for her. She'd learned Spanish now, some Arabic, enough Mandarin to manage basic medical questions. She collected languages like some people collected stamps, each one a tool, each one a bridge to someone who needed to be less alone. 2 years in, Nguyen came back to visit, fully healed, working again. He brought his whole family, brought food, Vietnamese dishes his wife had made. They ate together in the break room. Margaret's halting Vietnamese making them laugh, their English getting better every time they spoke. They'd become friends, family, almost. The kind that forms from shared trauma and gratitude and the strange bonds that crisis creates. He asked her why she'd helped him that day, why she'd stepped forward when everyone else had failed. She told him the truth, that she'd heard him begging not to die alone, that she'd remembered too many people who had, that she couldn't let it happen again. Not if she could stop it. He understood. He'd been there, he'd felt it. The terror of being invisible in your own death. They talked about his brother, about the hospital where he'd died, about fear and systems and the way language barriers could kill as surely as any injury, about how much it mattered to be seen, to be heard, to have someone who could tell you in words you understood that you were going to be okay, or that you weren't. That mattered too. Knowing the truth, even when the truth was terrible. Margaret's life had shape again, purpose. She still lived alone, still missed Robert, still had quiet evenings and British baking shows. But the quietness felt different now, earned, chosen. Not the default state of someone who'd given up, the deliberate rest of someone who fought hard and needed to recover between battles. She was 64 now, hands still shaky outside of work, knees that complained on stairs, gray hair that had gone completely white. But in the ER, none of that mattered. In the ER, she was exactly who she needed to be, who she'd always been, a person who stepped forward when everyone else stepped back, who spoke when others stayed silent, who'd learned long ago that the worst moments of someone's life required the best of whoever was there to witness them. The young nurses watched her, learned from her, not just the medical skills, but the other things, the softer things, how to be present with suffering, how to carry grief without letting it destroy you, how to find meaning in work that broke your heart on a regular basis. She taught them what Vietnam had taught her, what Boston had taught her, what every loss and every save had carved into her bones. That competence wasn't about speed or strength, it was about showing up, about doing the work even when it hurt, about being the person someone needed you to be, even when you weren't sure you had it in you anymore. That age was just time. And time gave you something youth never could, the knowledge that you'd survived before, that you could survive again, that the worst day of your life might still be ahead of you, but you'd already proven you could handle it. That invisibility was a choice. And choosing to be seen, choosing to step forward, choosing to let people know who you really were and what you'd really done, that was the bravest thing of all. Dr. Morrison retired 3 years after Margaret started. On his last day, he pulled her aside, told her something he'd never said before, that her application had almost gone in the trash, that he'd judged her, dismissed her, made assumptions based on numbers and prejudice and the kind of lazy thinking that missed what mattered, that hiring her had been the best decision he'd never wanted to make, that she'd changed the ER, changed how they thought about experience and age and what valuable looked like, that he was sorry it took a crisis for him to see it. She accepted his apology, told him she understood. People saw what they expected to see until reality forced them to look closer. It wasn't personal. It was human. The trick was learning from it, growing from it, being better next time. They shook hands. He left. She stayed. Because the work wasn't done. Would never be done. There would always be another ambulance, another crisis, another person who needed someone to see them, to hear them, to make their worst moment just a little bit less terrible. And Margaret would be there. Steady hands in the chaos, quiet voice in the fear, bridge across every language barrier and age gap and assumption that said she couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't be enough. She was enough. She'd always been enough. She just had to fight to make everyone else see it. The ER doors opened. Ambulance incoming, mass casualty, multiple patients, the familiar call of crisis. Margaret moved toward it, hands steady, heart ready, exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones most capable of saving us. Your past doesn't disqualify you from your future, it prepares you for it. True expertise doesn't announce itself with credentials or youth or confidence. It shows up quietly, with steady hands and the willingness to step forward when everyone else steps back. Margaret spent 40 years carrying skills nobody asked about, experience nobody valued, languages nobody knew she spoke. She could have stayed invisible, could have accepted the role they gave her and faded into retirement without making waves. But when crisis demanded it, she chose to be seen. She chose to use everything she'd learned, everything she'd survived, everything she'd become. And in doing so, she didn't just save one patient. She changed an entire ER's understanding of what valuable looks like. Think about the Margaret Chens in your own life. The people you've dismissed because of age, because of appearance, because of assumptions about what they can or can't contribute. Think about what you might be missing. What skills are hiding in plain sight? What experience is going unutilized because nobody thought to ask? And if you're the one being overlooked, remember this. Your moment will come. The crisis that only you can solve, the language only you can speak, the experience only you possess. When it does, step forward. Let them see who you really are. Your past has prepared you for exactly this. Don't waste it by staying invisible. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Someone who's been overlooked, someone who's doubting their value, someone who needs to remember that their experience, their age, their unique perspective, it all matters. Drop a comment about a time you were underestimated or a time you underestimated someone else. Let's learn from each other. And subscribe for more stories about everyday heroes who prove that the most powerful people are often the ones nobody sees coming.